In this lesson, we'll begin the process of connecting color maps to the squid's subsurface shading materials. So this is the effect that we left off with in our previous lesson, so you can see that we do have now a little bit of subsurface in place, but now we can begin the process of connecting in some maps and start to give this a little bit more interesting look. So let's begin this process by just taking our subsurface skin shader, and let's just start to actually bring in a texture. For this, we'll go over to Maya Nodes and drop in a file. We'll see here in just a minute how we can actually take one different color map and actually use this in multiple ways. So let's start by bringing in the squid body color. Let's go back to the hypershade over here, and let's take this file and we'll drop it into the actual diffuse color here, so that way we can start to get a little bit of shading at the topmost layer of our subsurface shader, which is really what this diffuse color is driving. We can also take this and maybe drop this into the front scattering color as well. Here we go. So now we get both maps in place, and let's just start by taking a look at what that gives us. Okay, and now you can start to see a little bit more of this subsurface effect that is beginning to take place. Again, we now have this backscattering color that is beginning to affect the actual subsurface material itself, but the actual material is still a little bit on the dark side. So let's take a look at how we can actually take this one map that we have and start to reuse it and repurpose it to actually create a couple of different effects here within this subsurface shader. So I'm going to take this map, select all of the connections, and press delete so that way I can sever those connections. Now what we want to do is use some of the color correcting tools here in Maya and actually separate this out into a couple of different maps, one for the front scattering color and one for the diffuse color. So let's begin this process by scrolling down inside the Maya nodes, and we're going to look for the Remap HSV, which is Remap Hue, Saturation, and Value. So let's take this node, we'll double click on it, we'll take this texture that we have, middle click, and drop it into the input color of this HSV remap node. Okay, now if we want to actually see what we are doing here, you'll notice that we do have the ability to come in and we can actually start to adjust things like the hue, saturation, but we really can't see what is happening. So one useful little way that I like to kind of preview this is to take something like a layered texture, alright, and we can just drop this HSV node, just middle click, drop it in. So there's Remap HSV, and we can take this first layer in this layered texture and just delete that. Alright, so now we can actually see, if we were to double click on this HSV node, any adjustments that we start to make, those will get piped out to this layered texture node. Alright, and really we could use anything for this. It just happens to be that this layered texture node actually lets us see the flattened out image that is coming into its input. So let's come in, we'll leave this kind of set roughly to where it originally was, and we can start to take this saturation and begin bringing this way down. Alright, so we start to get now this image that's much more toned down compared to what we had before. And a lot of times I find that this is a good starting point for sort of a topmost layer of skin, something that is a little bit more on the pale side. So we can maybe start to take this hue and give it just a little bit more of a red tone in here as well. There we go. So that way we wind up with something, again, just a little bit different than what we had before. So you can see these two images side by side. The one on the left is what we had before the hue adjustment, and this is what we have after. So now that we have this, we really don't need this layered texture for our shading network. This was really just for preview purposes. So now that we have this node in place, let's take the Remap HSV, middle click, and drop it into the diffuse color. Alright, excellent. Now let's do this one more time for the front scatter color. This will be the layer that is just above the surface of the skin, and usually I find this is a shader that's good to have sort of a reddish color on it, so it kind of mimics the effect of blood vessels and things like that. So let's scroll down to the Remap HSV. We'll drop in another one. Just like before, we'll take our map, middle click, drop it into color, take our layered texture, middle click. There we go. Again, just for preview purposes, we can now actually see this. So let's double click on the remap HSV. Let's start to come in and maybe alter the hue a little bit. There we go. So let's maybe go up to this hue and start to kind of choke some of these values down a little bit more. There we go. So that starts to now kind of increase this. So we can start to bump up the saturation a little bit more now that we have this hue kind of remapped to something a little bit more on the red side. So I've got both of these sliders down, so that way all the light and the dark colors are kind of remapped. You can see that gives us, again, just kind of this nice, a little bit more of a reddish result. Really kind of useful for simulating kind of that under layer of skin. So as you can see now, we have this one single texture map that's looped through a couple of these different HSV nodes to get two different results. So now this can go into the front scatter color. Alright, and let's see what that gives us. We'll save this for comparison and re-render. There you go, and you can start to see now how that starts to give us a little bit more of a reddish effect here. It's really kind of a subtle result, but it does now start to give us a little bit more of a kind of a realistic underbelly here. So if we need to, we could always come back to this fast simple and start to maybe bump up this diffuse weight a little bit more. There we go. And while we're at it, we could always maybe start to come in and maybe give this a little bit brighter saturation here, just because it is still a little bit muted. I'm kind of looking at this final result that we have here. So let's now re-render this. There we go. And now you can start to see with a little bit higher diffuse color and a little bit stronger saturation that we had on this diffuse texture map. Now that really kind of starts to give us something that is a little bit more flesh-like. If you compare what we had before to what we have now, overall it's just a little bit brighter now, a little bit more vibrant in color. Alright, so as you can see, it really is not an exact science. A lot of this just does come down to kind of adjusting and manipulating and using the nodes that you have at your disposal to get the result that you want. So just to finish this off, let's go back to this back subsurface color. And just to make the actual back scattering result a little bit stronger, as opposed to something like this orange color, let's start to focus on something that is maybe a little bit brighter. There we go. So that way the light that comes through should now be much lighter in intensity. And again, if we want, we can save this for comparison and re-render. There we go. And you can now see that gives us a little bit brighter light that comes through these tentacles. Looking at this, though, this is now probably a little bit too much penetration that we get in this light. So we could always come back and start to drop the subsurface radius and the depth. Instead of a value of 2, let's try something like 1. And again, we can save this for comparison. I always find this to be very, very useful to compare what we have now to what we had before. Alright, and you can see that if we take a look at that comparison, that what we had before, we actually probably did have a little bit too much light that was coming through his body as far as the overall backscattering is concerned, and now we've kind of managed to tone that down by just lowering that distance and start to get something that is just a little bit more favorable. Now, one issue that we do have when you look in here is that we do have quite a bit of this backscattering that is coming through the mouth area. And just like with the tentacles, this mouth area from the inside of his cheek to the outside of the cheek is a fairly thin area, so we do have quite a bit of light that is able to pass through. So what we want to do is try to minimize this light bleeding effect as much as possible. So what we'll do in the next lesson is take a look at how we can actually go back to ZBrush and then generate a couple of extra maps to help us out with this process. So we'll do that in the next lesson.